By the time the water crossed the second overflow marker at Harlan Gorge, the monitoring screen inside the Crestline Dam Authority Operations Center showed a single green light. Not amber, not red, green, nominal. Within tolerance, nothing to report. 3 engineers were watching that screen. A duty supervisor was watching those engineers. Nobody in the room was looking at the rain gauge on the eastern ridge, which had filled and drained twice in the previous 4 hours, a rate the region had not recorded in 40 years. Nobody was checking the soil saturation map from the upstream forestry service, which had sent an advisory that morning that went unopened in an automated inbox. And nobody was thinking about the north spillway gate, a mechanism that had been rebuilt in 1989, repaired again in 1997, and documented in careful handwritten entries across 11 separate volumes of a maintenance ledger that no longer existed in any official record. The man who had written those entries was 68 years old and had been retired for 6 years. He was sitting at his kitchen table 12 miles from the dam when the rain started again at 4:40 in the afternoon. He had not been watching the news. He had been repairing a hand drill, the kind with a wooden handle and a brace mechanism that most people considered a relic. He kept it on the shelf above his workbench for the same reason he kept most things, because it worked. His name was Samuel Rook. And the thing that was about to matter most in Harlan County was not the sensor array on the dam face, not the automated flood management software the authority had purchased for $700,000 3 years after his retirement, not the emergency dispatch protocol, not the risk assessment model commissioned by the state. It was a water-stained logbook sitting on the bottom shelf of a cabinet in his living room, and the fact that he remembered every word in it. Samuel Rook grew up in the valley that Harlan Gorge Dam was built to protect. He was 11 years old when they poured the first concrete, and his father drove him out to watch from the ridge. He did not remember the machinery clearly. He remembered the sound, low and continuous and larger than anything he had heard before. A sound that seemed to come from the ground rather than from the equipment working on it. He stood beside his father on the ridge for nearly 2 hours, and neither of them said much because the occasion seemed to require quiet. His father had farmed the valley below for 26 years. The dam was being built, in part, because of the flood that had taken a third of the valley's topsoil in 1951, before Samuel was born. The year Samuel's father had lost the winter crop and 2 of his neighbors' outbuildings and spent 3 months rebuilding a fence line that should not have needed rebuilding. The dam, then, was not an abstraction to the Rook family. It was a calculation. Decades of effort exchanged for the possibility of not losing everything in a single wet spring. Samuel carried that understanding with him for the rest of his life, not loudly, not as something he repeated in speeches or mentioned at introductions. He simply carried it the way a man carries a weight that has been on his back, long enough that he no longer notices it as separate from himself. He joined the Dam Authority as a maintenance technician at 23, 2 years after completing a vocational certification in hydraulic systems at the County Technical College. The work was physical and methodical and often tedious, and he was suited to it entirely. He had a patience that his supervisors noticed early. He could spend an afternoon tracing a pressure anomaly through 300 feet of culvert and not once lose the thread of what he was looking for. By 30, he was a senior maintenance technician. By 38, he was chief of mechanical systems, a title that meant, in practical terms, that he was responsible for knowing how everything at Harlan Gorge Dam worked. Not how it was supposed to work according to the original specifications, how it actually worked. In its current condition, with its current history, with its current weaknesses. That distinction mattered. It mattered because dams do not age the way a building ages. A building settles, cracks, weathers, and the evidence of that process is usually visible if you look. A dam ages through things you cannot see without instruments, and sometimes through things you cannot see even with them. The stress patterns in a concrete structure are invisible until they are not. The gradual alteration of sediment load changes the distribution of pressure against a face that was calculated for a different equilibrium. A gate mechanism that has been operated 10,000 times carries stress in its housing that a visual inspection will not reveal. Samuel understood this not from theory alone, though he had read the theory carefully, but from contact. From the specific quality of resistance a gate handle offered when the mechanism was running clean versus when something was beginning to wear. From the way a particular section of the service tunnel smelled after a wet spring, different from the way it smelled after a dry one. From the fact that he had been standing at a particular monitoring station on the north face during the flood season of 2003. And, Note that the overflow reading was 3 centimeters higher than the sensor indicated. That discrepancy had turned out to be a calibration error in the sensor housing, a consequence of a small deposit of mineral scale on the probe. The authority fixed it within a week. But Samuel had written it down. He had written it in the maintenance ledger he kept by hand, in addition to the digital system, because he did not entirely trust the digital system, not because he distrusted technology, because he understood that institutional memory is not always what a system can recall. It is also what a person remembers to record. He kept the ledgers consistently for 31 years, 11 volumes, each one dated on the spine, each one organized by system, by location, by season, each one cross-referenced in his own shorthand to earlier volumes when a pattern repeated. The handwriting was not elegant, but it was precise. The entries were not long, but they were complete. The digital maintenance system the authority adopted in 2007 was comprehensive and capable and faster to query than any paper record. It was also a system that had been populated by data transfer from electronic logs and from newly entered records after the transition date. The paper ledgers had been scanned officially and the scans archived. The scans were stored on a server that was migrated twice and decommissioned, once in the years that followed. Nobody had checked whether all 11 volumes survived the final migration. Samuel had asked twice in the last 2 years before his retirement. He had been told that the archive was complete. He had not been shown evidence of this, and he had not pushed further because he had learned over 4 decades that some questions were heard as complaints if you asked them more than twice. In 2016, the Dam Authority entered into a contract with an engineering consultancy to install a comprehensive remote monitoring system. Samuel was still chief of mechanical systems at the time. He attended the installation review meetings. He asked questions that were considered by the project manager from the consultancy to be unnecessarily technical for a procurement discussion. He had asked specifically about the placement of the pressure sensors on the north spillway gate housing. The consultancy's proposal placed the primary sensor on the downstream housing face, which measured the pressure differential in the gate itself, the water pressure pushing against the gate as the reservoir filled. Samuel pointed out that the critical failure point on the north gate was not the gate face pressure. It was the hinge assembly load. The sensor, as proposed, would not capture the stress distribution across the upper fitting collar. The project manager had a slide that showed the sensor array coverage as a percentage of the structure. The coverage was rated at 93%. Samuel said that the 7% not covered included the location he was describing. The project manager said the industry standard placement protocol had been followed. Samuel said the industry standard placement protocol had been developed for a different gate housing configuration than the one installed at Harlan Gorge in 1997. The meeting moved on. The sensor was installed as proposed. Samuel wrote an entry in the ledger that day. He described the meeting, the decision, and the specific gap in monitoring coverage that would result. He described it in factual terms, without bitterness, because bitterness was not useful in a maintenance record. The entry ended with a note that read, "The upper hinge assembly load on the north gate is not currently captured by the sensor array. Manual inspection remains the only means of direct assessment. Recommended frequency, twice annually, or after any event in which reservoir level exceeds 88% capacity." The recommendation was entered into the digital system as a routine inspection item. After Samuel retired, the inspection item was rescheduled twice in the first year, once because a technician was on medical leave and once because a planned reservoir drawdown for a different maintenance task was postponed. In the second year, it was completed once instead of the recommended twice. In the third year, the authority commissioned an operational efficiency review, and several routine inspection items were consolidated or extended in frequency as part of the revised protocol. The North Gate hinge assembly inspection was extended to annual. By the time of the storm, it had been 14 months since the last physical inspection. None of this had been flagged by the automated system because the automated system was measuring what it was built to measure and finding it acceptable. He retired in the spring of 2019. His retirement party was held in the authority's conference room on a Friday afternoon. There was sheet cake and a framed photograph of the dam at sunrise and a card signed by 37 people. The director gave a short speech about institutional knowledge and lasting contributions. Samuel shook every hand in the room and went home. He took the physical ledgers with him when he left. He had not hidden them or removed them illicitly. When he asked whether they should be kept on site after the digital migration, The records administrator had told him they were his if he wanted them, since the official archive was considered complete. He put them in 2 cardboard boxes, placed them in the back of his truck, and drove home. He put them on the bottom shelf of the cabinet in his living room and did not think about them again for 6 years. The retirement suited him better than he had expected. He had worried in the months before leaving that the absence of the dam would leave a kind of vacuum. Instead, he found that he could take up space in his own days without difficulty. He fixed things. He walked. He maintained a small vegetable garden with the same methodical patience he had applied to spillway gates. He had a neighbor, Vera Cole, who was 72 and had lived in the valley her whole life, and who sometimes came over in the evenings to sit on the porch and talk about nothing of particular consequence, which turned out to be exactly the right kind of conversation. He missed the dam the way you miss a place you have known very well. Not with longing, with a particular awareness of its absence, a background frequency he had grown accustomed to and no longer heard, until the afternoon of the rain. He was not watching the weather services closely. He had not been watching them at all, but he felt the shift in the air the way he always had, a change in the weight of it, the way the sound carried differently across the ridge when moisture was concentrating at altitude. He stood in the doorway of the back porch for a moment and looked at the sky over the eastern hills and felt the particular quality of the light and thought briefly that this was a lot of water coming. He went back inside. He made coffee. He finished the hand drill repair. And then at 6:20 in the evening his phone rang, and it was a man whose voice he recognized, but whose name took him a moment to place. The name was Dillon Marsh, and he was 31 years old and had been a junior maintenance technician at Harlan Gorge for 3 years. Samuel had never been his direct supervisor, but Dillon had been assigned to the North Spillway inspection rotation in his first year, and Samuel had walked him through the procedure twice and had apparently made an impression that outlasted the formal instruction. Dillon was calling from a parking lot outside the authority building. He was not supposed to be calling. He had been told by the duty supervisor that the situation was under control and that the sensor array was showing nominal and that there was no basis for elevated concern. But Dillon had been standing in the operations center looking at the rainfall data coming in from the eastern ridge, and he had felt something that he could not name precisely, but that he was unwilling to dismiss. He said to Samuel, voice tight and careful, "The system is showing green on the north gate, but the rain totals are not adding up for me. I know this might be nothing. I know you have been retired a long time, but I wanted to ask you something." Samuel put his coffee down. He said, "Ask," Dillon said. "How much sustained rainfall, at this intensity, over the eastern watershed, before the old North Spillway gate starts to carry more water than the sensor is rated to measure?" There was a silence on Samuel's end of the line that lasted for exactly 4 seconds, not because he was thinking about whether he knew the answer, because he was already ahead of the question and was working out something more specific. Then he said, "What is the current reservoir level?" Dillon told him. Samuel said, "Are you looking at the raw sensor feed or the processed output?" Dillon said, "The processed output, the dashboard." Samuel said, "Go to the raw feed. Tell me what the pressure differential is on the north gate housing, not the overflow indicator. The pressure differential on the housing." There was a pause, the sound of footsteps, the ambient noise of a control room. Then Dillon's voice again, quieter now. There was a quality to it that Samuel recognized, the voice of a person who has just seen something and is deciding whether what they are seeing is real. He read the number. Samuel stood up from his chair. The pressure differential Dillon read was not on any alarm threshold. It was not flagged in the software. It was within the range the system considered normal. But Samuel knew that number in the context of the specific failure history of the Northgate housing, in the context of a wet spring in a year when snowmelt had already pushed the reservoir to 92% capacity twice before summer, in the context of a repair done in 1997 that had corrected one structural issue and introduced a smaller one that had never been fully resolved because the contractor had used a slightly non-standard fitting that changed the load distribution on the upper hinge assembly in a way that nobody had formally documented. Nobody except Samuel. He said to Dillon, "Do not hang up. I need to get something from the cabinet." He put the phone on the kitchen table. He went to the living room. He opened the bottom shelf of the cabinet and pulled out the second box. He found the 9th volume of the ledger. He found the section on the North Spillway gate. He found the entry from the spring of 2001, which was the first time he had documented the load anomaly after the 1997 repair. He came back to the phone. He said, I need to talk to whoever is in charge of the control room tonight, Dillon said. The duty supervisor is Hannah Cole. She is good at her job. She is also confident in the sensor array, Samuel said. Is there anyone above her you can reach? Dillon said. The authority director is Marcus Pratt. I do not have his direct line. He does not usually come in for weather events unless the alarm threshold is reached, Samuel said. Call him anyway. Tell him a retired chief of mechanical systems is asking to speak with him. Tell him it is about the Northgate housing. Tell him it is about the 1997 repair and a pressure reading that the current software is not calibrated to flag. There was a silence. Then Dillon said, he is not going to like that. Samuel said, I know, call him. Marcus Pratt was 44 years old and had been authority director for 3 years. He had come from a state infrastructure management background. He was organized, decisive, and data-driven. He trusted the sensor array because the sensor array had been audited the previous year and had performed within specification. He trusted the automated flood management system because it had been validated by the engineering contractor and had run without significant error since installation. He did not know Samuel Rook personally. He had received a briefing on key institutional history when he took the role, and Samuel's name had appeared in a single line as a long-serving former chief of mechanical systems, retired, no ongoing advisory relationship. When Dillon reached him by phone at 7:15 in the evening, Marcus was at home reviewing the rainfall projections on his laptop. He had already spoken to the duty supervisor and had been told the situation was nominal. He listened to Dillon's message. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give me the number for this Rook." Samuel had already found the relevant entries in the 9th volume by the time Marcus called. He walked Marcus through what he needed in about 4 minutes. He did not use more words than the situation required. He described the 1997 repair in specific terms. He described the non-standard fitting and the load distribution consequence. He described the threshold at which the upper hinge assembly began to carry stress that was not visible in the pressure differential reading, because the sensor was mounted downstream of the critical joint, not at it. He told Marcus the number that the raw pressure differential would reach before the physical stress on the assembly exceeded the safe range. He told him that the current number Dillon had read was 14% below that threshold, he said. At the current rainfall rate and with the upstream flow from the eastern watershed, you will cross that threshold in approximately 2 hours, possibly less, Marcus said. The model does not show that, Samuel said. The model does not know about the fitting. The entry was in the paper ledger. The digital archive does not have that volume. There was a silence. A long one. Marcus said, "How certain are you?" Samuel said, "Certain enough to tell you that if I were still chief of mechanical systems tonight, I would have a crew on the Northgate housing right now, and I would have the overflow pathway on the south face standing by for partial diversion." Another silence. Shorter this time, Marcus said, "Stay on the line." What followed was not smooth. The duty supervisor, Hannah Cole, was good at her job, and she was not inclined to alter her assessment of a nominal system based on a phone call from a retired technician. She said this clearly to Marcus when he called her from the car on his way to the operations center. She was professional about it. She was not dismissive of Samuel specifically. She was dismissive of the mechanism by which the information had arrived. Unofficial, unverified, absent from any current system record. Marcus understood her position. He had made the same kind of argument himself at previous postings. The value of structured process is that it filters noise from signal. The risk of structured process is that it filters everything through a sieve that was built for a different kind of signal. He arrived at the operations center at 7:42. He asked to see the raw sensor feed on the Northgate housing. The number had moved. It was now 8% below the threshold Samuel had described. He's called Samuel again. He said, "Still 2 hours," said, "Less now. Maybe 90 minutes. What is the upstream flow reading from the eastern intake channel?" The intake channel reading was not on the main dashboard. A technician had to pull it separately. When she did, the number was higher than expected, significantly higher. Samuel heard the silence on the other end of the line and understood what it meant. He said, "You need to make a decision in the next 15 minutes. Marcus said, "If I open a partial diversion on the south face at night with the current downstream flow, it will push water into the agricultural corridor below the dam. There will be property damage," Samuel said. "If the Northgate housing fails under pressure at this reservoir level, the overflow will not be partial. It will be uncontrolled. And the downstream channel south of the valley road cannot absorb uncontrolled overflow. You know what is in that valley." Marcus knew what was in that valley. He had driven through it 2 weeks earlier on a tour of downstream infrastructure. 740 residential properties, a care facility for elderly residents, a school building currently empty for summer but used during the week as a community food distribution point. The Valley Road itself, the only arterial route connecting 3 smaller townships to the main highway. He stood in the operations center with the phone in one hand and the raw sensor feed on the screen in front of him and the authority of his position in full weight on his shoulders, and he made the decision that the situation required. He ordered the partial diversion. He ordered a crew to the North Gate housing with lights and monitoring equipment. He ordered the emergency downstream notification to go out to the agricultural corridor properties, which meant families getting calls at 8 in the evening telling them to move vehicles and equipment to higher ground. He ordered Dillon Marsh, who was still in the building, to stay in the operations center and remain on the line with Samuel Rook. The crew reached the North Gate housing at 8:17. They had flashlights and a manual pressure gauge and a set of physical inspection tools that most of them had used primarily during training exercises. The lead technician, a woman named Ruth Aiken, who had been with the authority for 11 years, performed the physical inspection of the upper hinge assembly in the rain with a flashlight held between her shoulder and jaw. She found it in the third pass, a hairline separation in the housing collar around the upper hinge fitting, invisible from any standard viewing angle. Visible when the flashlight was held at a specific oblique angle and the surface was wet, the kind of thing you would see if you knew to look for it. If someone had told you the exact location based on 31 years of documented maintenance history, and a record that the official system did not contain, she called back to Marcus. She said, "He is right about the fitting," she said. If the pressure differential had reached the threshold he described, this would have opened up. Marcus stood at the operations center window and looked at the rainfall moving across the floodlights on the dam face. He asked how long to stabilize. Ruth said 6 to 8 hours to secure the housing with emergency clamps and relieve the stress. They could begin immediately. They needed the partial diversion maintained and the reservoir level held below the critical pressure range while worked, Marcus said. Begin. The partial diversion released approximately 80,000 cubic meters of water into the agricultural corridor over the following 4 hours. 12 families evacuated as a precaution. 3 of them returned to find standing water in outbuildings and storage structures. None returned to find structural damage to their homes. The farmers in the corridor received formal notification from the authority the following morning, and the damage assessment process began within 48 hours. The North Gate housing repair took 11 hours, including the emergency stabilization and a subsequent full collar replacement conducted over the following 3 days. The dam held. The valley below received the rainfall from that night and the next 2 days through a managed overflow system, operating exactly as it had been designed to operate. Controlled, deliberate, graduated. 740 homes did not flood. The care facility did not evacuate. The Valley Road stayed open. Samuel was still on the phone with Dillon when the crew confirmed the housing. Stabilization was holding. It was past midnight. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the 9th ledger open in front of him and a cup of coffee that had been cold for 2 hours. Dillon said, "It held." Samuel said, "Good." There was a pause. Then Dillon said, "How did you know about the fitting?" After 6 years away from the site, Samuel looked at the open ledger. The entry from spring 2001 was in front of him. His own handwriting, compact and precise, describing the anomaly, the date, the measurement, the conclusion, the note to revisit in the following season. He said, "Because I wrote it down," he said, "and because when you write something down carefully enough, you do not forget it." He said the entry is in Volume 9. The date is April 14, 2001. If anyone at the authority wants to see it, they can come here and I will show them the original. Marcus Pratt arrived at Samuel's house the following morning. At 9 he came alone. He had a coffee from the drive-thru on the highway, and he looked like a man who had slept 3 hours and was operating on something beyond caffeine alone. He knocked at the door and Samuel let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Samuel put the 9th volume open between them and walked him through the entries. Marcus read them carefully. He read them the way a person reads something they should have had access to a long time ago. His expression did not change much. He was not a man who wore things easily on his face. But at one point, he put his finger on a specific line from 2009. A follow-up Samuel had written after the second annual inspection of the same housing collar, noting that the separation was continuing to develop at a rate consistent with the original projection. He said, "This was in the archive scan." Samuel said, "It should have been. All 11 volumes were submitted for scanning. Whether the migration preserved all of them is a different question." Marcus said, "We will audit the archive." Samuel said, "Yes, you should." Marcus looked at the remaining volumes stacked beside the cabinet. He said, "I would like to request that these be formally donated to the authority's records collection, with proper accession and indexing this time." Samuel said, "I am not opposed to that." Marcus said, "I would also like to request that you consider serving in an informal advisory capacity. Unpaid, if that is how you prefer it. Accessible when something like last night happens. The knowledge in these volumes does not exist anywhere else, and it needs somewhere to live beyond this living room." Samuel was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window toward the ridge. The rain had stopped in the early hours. The morning was gray and still, and the valley below the ridge was wet and green and intact. He said, "I will think about it." He did not say yes immediately because he had been retired for 6 years and had made his peace with that, and he was not certain he wanted to trade the peace for something else. But he also understood, without needing to say it to Marcus or to anyone, that the conversation they had just had was the kind that changes the shape of what comes next. Not dramatically, quietly. The way the ground changes after rain, the same surface, slightly different beneath it. The audit of the digital archive was completed over the following 2 weeks. It confirmed that volumes 7 and 9 of the maintenance ledger had been lost in the second server migration, 6 years earlier. The scans had existed, the migration had been incomplete, nobody had checked. A formal correction was entered into the authority's records. The original physical ledgers were accessioned into the authority's archive, with a full indexing process overseen by a records specialist brought in from the State Historical Commission. Each volume received an individual finding aid. Each entry cross-referenced to the digital record it should have complemented. Volume 9 received a notation on its finding aid that described the circumstances of the night of the storm, not as a dramatic narrative, as a factual record of how the information it contained had been applied, the date, the personnel involved, the outcome. Dillon Marsh was formally commended by the authority director for initiating the contact outside normal protocol. Marcus told him in the written commendation that sound judgment under pressure is not measured by whether the action fits within the standard process. It is measured by whether the action fits within what the situation required. Ruth Aiken supervised the full collar replacement on the Northgate housing. When the work was complete, and the new fitting was correctly installed, and the assembly had been tested through a full pressure cycle, she asked that the repair be formally documented in the maintenance system, with a note in plain language describing what the previous fitting had been, why it had failed progressively over 2 decades, and what the correct specification was going forward. She said to the junior technician entering the record, "Write it so that whoever reads this in 15 years understands exactly what we did and why. Do not assume they will know the history. Put the history in the record." The junior technician, who was 24 years old and had joined the authority 8 months earlier, wrote it down. Samuel did not attend any official ceremony. The authority sent a letter of formal thanks. Marcus called twice in the following month with specific questions about other systems Samuel had documented. Samuel answered the questions from memory and then, each time, pulled the relevant volume and confirmed the entry and read it aloud to make sure the current record was updated correctly. He did not return to the dam site that autumn. He intended to at some point, and he expected he would eventually. But for the time being, he was content to be 12 miles away, with the ledgers on the shelf and the valley intact outside his window. Vera Cole came over on a Thursday evening in September, and they sat on the porch as they sometimes did, and she said she had heard the story from her nephew who worked in the county emergency office, and that she thought Samuel should have been on the news. Samuel said he did not think so. Vera said, "Why not?" Samuel said, "Because the story is not about me. The story is about why nobody checked whether the migration was complete. The story is about why a maintenance record that existed in handwriting for 31 years was allowed to disappear in a server transfer. If you put me on the news, people focus on the person. The thing that needs attention is the record," Vera said. "Both things can be true," Samuel said. "I suppose." He looked at the ridge. The light was going out of the sky to the west in long, slow layers of gray and amber, he said. "My father drove me out to watch them build that dam when I was 11 years old. We stood on the ridge for 2 hours. He did not say much. But on the drive home he said one thing, and I do not think he intended it as wisdom. I think he was just describing what he had observed." Vera waited. Samuel said, "He said, they built it to remember the flood. The day they forget the flood is the day they will have to learn it again. The evening settled around the porch. In the valley below, the lights of the farmhouses came on one by one. The dam held. And in the records room of the Crestline Dam Authority, on a shelf that had been empty for 6 years, 11 volumes sat in the correct order with their spines facing out, each one dated, each one indexed, each one accessible to whoever came next and understood enough to open them. The ledger had not saved the valley because it was old. It had saved the valley because one man had kept it honest, because he had written the truth down when he saw it, in a form that did not depend on a server or a migration or a system that someone else managed. Because when the modern record forgot what the river was capable of, the old record remembered. And because one young technician standing in a parking lot at 6:20 in the evening had understood, without being able to fully explain it, that the green light on the dashboard was not the same thing as safety. Progress had built the dam. Progress had engineered the sensors and the software and the automated management system. But Progress had also migrated the server twice and checked the completion rate once, and called the archive complete without opening every file. The ledger was not the opposite of Progress. It was the part of Progress that Progress had forgotten to carry forward. The water had risen. The valley had held. And the morning after the rain, Samuel Rook had walked out to his back porch and looked at the ridge and listened to the valley, the way he always had, with the same quiet attention he had brought to every year of the work, and heard it whole.